This week we'll be discussing syntax and semantics from the speech-to-print text. So what is syntax? So when you think of syntax, I always remember syntax equals sentence. That's my little uh, memorization strategy for it. So syntax or sentences, or which are sentences, and sentences are frames into which words can be slotted and carry meaning. For sentence production, it requires creativity and compliance with the syntactic rules and conventions expected. So syntax are the rules governing our sentence structure. Good readers process the structure of sentences and meaning quickly and accurately, and they make inferences as they go along with reading. But poor readers, they don't do this, but they benefit from instruction that builds syntactic awareness. So building awareness of sentence structure, sentence rules, how words may and may not be joined together. Good writers know how to think about word order and its relationship with the ideas in text as well, so that you can rephrase a sentence to communicate exactly what you want. That's a lot of the editing process involves that of moving words around to make sure that your syntactic your sentence meaning is coming across the way you want it to, and you'll get into that further in your studies. These are just the basic, and I want to point out that for syntax, their whole entire next book that we're doing in this course is going to be devoted to syntax, so we'll get much more in depth. This is I hear people say, a helicopter ride over syntax, just general overview. We're really not getting in that depth until after this week. So what is correct or incorrect syntax? The study of syntax is not equivalent to the study of traditional grammar, such as those diagramming sentences that you learn in English, but the study of the architecture of phrases and sentences that reflect the mental representations. So you have two types of structures. You have phrase structures and phrase structure trees, and then you have syntactic categories. And this allows the speakers of a language to judge what word sequences are permissible, interpret the meaning of word sequences, and generate novel word sequences. So linguists study descriptive grammar, or which are the rule systems to explain and describe actual patterns of speaking, how we string words together. Now, the standards of correctness that editors use and that you might use in writing of English they're called prescriptive grammar, and such as whenever you're writing a paper, you might be using the APA manual. The APA is doing prescriptive grammar and outlining certain rules for you to follow. Now, in addition to this, education, home dialect, and the linguistic community influences our judgment on grammatical correctness. It drives me nuts to hear somebody say, "Where you at?" But in the South, many people might say that's a correct question format because they hear it so frequently, and the meaning is understood, even though it doesn't follow a proper English grammatical structure. So acceptable grammatical usage is always in a state of flux. It's always changing. Now, natural knowledge of syntax. We just kind of naturally acquire this. Something beyond the surface arrangement of words governs the structure of sentences. We know that word order influences meaning, and that syntactic knowledge influences how words must be used in relation to word order. Word order may change, but meaning must stay constant. And the book has several examples about the different types of sentences and how changing the word order might influence what you're trying to say. These are the times that try men's souls versus these times that are men's try the souls. Try times men's are souls these. That, that 4C example on page 156, I can't even read it because it doesn't naturally flow, because it doesn't make sense. So we know that there are certain rules that we have to follow. Now, there's the natural grammatical knowledge. This learned from exposure to language. It's the ability to know what is permitted and to understand the relationship between word order and word meaning. So how do we know this? Most of us just learn it from hearing language spoken. Of course, our language disordered children have struggles with this, but most of us, just as part of language development, will learn this. And when you talk about language development and children especially, you'll talk about when they're about between 18 months and 24 months old, and they start stringing more and more words together. Really about 2 years old, they start stringing words together into sentences, and they experience what's called the syntactic boom, where they start understanding the process of how we combine words to form sentences and make longer utterances, and then it just seems to be exponential how much they can learn in their language in that time known as the syntactic boom. Again, further in your coursework, you'll talk about that. So what's the evidence for syntactic structures? How do we know that these exist? Well, most of what we say is novel. There's so many different combinations of words that we can have that most of what we say is the first time it's ever been said. And of course, we have our certain phrases and fallbacks that we use, but everybody's usually going to say it in a different way that's unique to them. So it's not necessary to hear a sentence to be able to interpret its meaning or judge grammaticality. It's not necessarily to have heard it to be able to formulate it either. I'm just speaking from my thoughts in these videos sometimes, but I'm able to formulate those words into grammatical sentences, hopefully most of the time, and put them together to make meaning. So I didn't have to hear it spoken by someone else to be able to do that. Groupings of words may sound like sentences, but not mean anything too. So you could have words that just go together. Talib left the writing so swarmedly that it delineated. That's not a sentence because those aren't words, but you could say, all right, well, that's following certain rules that I know. And I know how to read that too because of the syntactic rules that are governing as far as those morphological rules and the phonological rules. So, what do we essentially know about syntax? The following truths of syntax. First of all, number one, words and sentences do not have to make sense. Even though we recognize that the word order fits in syntactic pattern, it doesn't have to make sense. For sentences to make sense, speakers must follow a certain word order constraint. So we can't just string a bunch of words together like cup, drink, cat, did, from. That just wouldn't make sense. It's just words, and the words are right, but the syntactic order is wrong. For sentences to make sense, speakers must follow certain word order constraints. So if you have the, something must be followed by the because it's a modifier. The order and grouping of words allows understanding of relationships among the ideas, such as subject-object relationships. So we know if you're going to do, you must do something. There must be something there to do. It must be, you can't just do without representation of the completion of the task. Some sentences are ambiguous. We don't exactly know their meaning without the context. It can be interpreted in two or more ways. Sentences with different word sequences can mean the same thing. So just because it has different words doesn't mean you can't have the same meaning behind it. And then words can be combined in an infinite number of ways within the syntactic frames of rules of a language. So, there's infinite ways this can happen. And remember, syntax, that's one of the 5 essential components of language, and that every language has syntactic structure. So whether you're speaking Spanish or whether you're speaking English or French or Latin, everything has rules that we're following. And this is where you'll see the breakdown in the English language learning sometimes, or even if you say you're trying to learn Spanish, and I remember when I took Spanish and we had to learn how to conjugate the verb. And that had a lot to do with syntactic orders and governing of rules, and that's why you can recognize second language speakers because they don't know the exact syntactic rules that need to be followed for word order and structure. So what are the parts of sentences? First of all, we have parts of speech is the English grammar terms. Sometimes they are also called these lexical properties. And remember our lexicon. I think I've mentioned it before, but I know we talk about it in the next chapter. Lexicon is everything, all the words that make up word meaning in your brain. And so, parts of speech, noun, pronoun, verb, adverb, adjective, that's what we know from English grammar. But there's, the linguists go farther in the study about the parts of speech and parts of phrases. So we have slots or syntactic categories. That's the focus for linguists in the study of syntax. We have groupings of expressions that have the same function within a sentence structure. And then we have word or word groups that can substitute for one another without affecting the structure of the sentences. So phrases, looking at phrases that can stand, they don't have to necessarily stand in isolation, but they do carry meaning within their phrase structure. A phrase is a natural grouping of words that seem glued together as a functional unit. They clearly go together or work together within the architecture of the sentence. So the phrase has to it's the noun clause and the noun phrase and the verb phrase. So the subject is the noun phrase plus any modifiers to that. And so the example the book uses is the driver totaled the car. So the driver is the noun phrase because the is modifying driver, the driver being the noun and the subject. Now the predicate is the verb phrase that describes the action or state attributable to the subject plus any additional words that tell us more about the action or state of being. So the total the car, total being the verb and the car being what was totaled. All right, so we have direct objects, and of course you'll probably remember this from English, direct objects and indirect objects. So a direct object is the noun phrase that functions as the direct object of what's following the verb. We also have prepositional phrases, so anything with in, on, under, between, beside, to. Remember all those prepositions that you learned back when you were in English. It's a grouping of words within a preposition. So you can add more to the sentence, and the author continues to expand the sentence throughout the examples of the chapter. But you could say the driver totaled the car in the driveway, for instance. All right, and then, so that's phrases. Now let's move into clauses, because clauses are different from phrases in that it belongs to the syntactic category of a group of words containing a subject and a predicate. So within the phrases, you have the subject phrase, the verb phrase, or the predicate. And then those two combined create a clause. So one clause contains the subject and the predicate. Now you have an independent clause that stands alone, all by itself. I walked to the store. And then you have the dependent clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence. So before I went to church, I walked to the store. Before I went to the church is a dependent clause, and the independent clause is I walked to the store. And the dependent clause also contains the subject and a predicate. Anytime you have a clause, it's going to contain a subject and a predicate, but the type of clause varies. All right, so what are simple, compound, and complex sentences? So these are how the clauses combine together. So we have phrases at the top of the little pyramid, and then they expand out into the clauses, and then the clauses expand out into simple, compound, and complex sentences. So a simple sentence is a single independent clause that can stand alone. A compound sentence is one in which two or more independent clauses have been joined by coordinating conjunction. Harry molded the dough, and Hannah baked the bread. Jeff drove off the road, for he was in a blinding snowstorm. So the conjunction is joining the sentences, but Jeff drove off the road is one independent clause, and he was in a blinding snowstorm is another independent clause. They can stand alone without that combination. And that's one of the first things you can work on too when you do therapy is sentence combining and how we can take those two sentences and combine them with a certain conjunction. And then you have to have students choose which conjunction is best as well. So a compound sentence, two more independent clauses. A complex sentence is one or more dependent clauses are attached or embedded in the independent clause. And then you have different types of dependent clauses attached to the independent clauses. And that's when our language gets very complex. A simple sentence, that's easy to understand. The boy walked to the store. That's simple. There's only one clause. There's only one subject, one predicate. There's nothing to process there. Compound sentence, the boy walked to the store and bought a Coke. All right, the boy walked to the store, one independent clause, bought a coat with the assumed he, because you combined it with the subject of the boy in the first sentence. That's still two independent clauses. But now when we get into the complexity of the boy walked to the store where he bought a Coke that was too hot to drink. Oh, wow, I've just thrown three clauses at you. So you've got to break it down to the types of clauses that are. So a relevant clause, that, who, and what pronouns are in relative clauses. So when I was frightened, I hid under the bed. Although she made a good argument, Nancy lost the vote. Columbus believed that the earth was flat. He thought that he would find India. So those are examples of relative clauses. A participle is a word formed from a verb that functions as part of a verb phrase. So you have two kinds of participles used in English. A present tense are formed by adding ing to a base verb, and a past tense formed by adding ed to a verb. So past participles and present participles. Past tense participles can be used as adjectives. An exhilarated fan. I previously bought tickets. As adjectives with passive voice constructions, the car was totaled, or with the verb have to make the perfect past tense. He had shouted his lungs. Present tense participles are found in the progressive or continuous form of a verb. He was shouting. And then you also have gerunds within the participles, where nouns created from verbs. Flying can be stressful. So dependent clauses introduced by participles. Knowing that the weather would be poor, she canceled her trip. Wondering where they were embarking, Craig called the tour company's office. So it was not only relative, like the relative clauses that modify the independent clauses. Now we throw in participles where you're changing nouns to verbs and verbs to nouns. Getting a little bit more complex. Finally, we have infinitive clauses, which can be embedded into complex sentences. And an infinitive clause is anything with the verb to, so the to be verbs. To believe that extraterrestrials visit Nevada is strange. To keep on doing. This is, it has no tense, and oftentimes in writing you'll hear this referred to as passive voice, and I was always very discouraged in English whenever writing to not use passive voice. So those are some examples of the clauses that we have in our sentence combining. Again, we'll get deeper into syntax as we get farther into the semester. This is just the helicopter ride. All right, the syntactic changes. How do sentences grow and change? So single words can function as noun phrases, and the pronoun can substitute for a noun phrase. Then you have phrases that are structures of sentences contain groups of words that fit the slots for allowable syntactic categories. Elaborating sentences work systematically within the subject noun phrase and are the main verb phrase, like adding adjectives, articles, prepositional phrases, etc. Sentence meaning is governed by underlying hierarchical structures that allow us to interpret the clusters of words or phrases that convey sense. I'm sorry, I completely skipped conjunctions. Let me go back for a second. Sorry. Conjunctions. The types of conjunctions we have with coordinating conjunctions that join syntactic elements from the same category. Fanboys. That's the acronym for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So those are coordinating conjunctions. They all are in the same category. Subordinating conjunctions or connect subordinate clauses to a main clause. A subordinate is another word for a dependent clause to a main clause, which is usually an independent clause, but it doesn't have to be an independent clause. So you have correlative conjunctions or pairs of words used to join together similar elements, both and, not only, but also either or, neither nor. Then you have conjunctive adverbs, which are adverbs and conjunctions that can join two independent clauses. They're usually set off by commas. The meanwhile, fortunately, still, nevertheless. When two independent clauses are connected with a conjunctive adverb, they must be separated by a semicolon, not just a comma. Other conjunctive adverbs also, anyway, besides, therefore. So these are words that add a lot to our language and to the complexity of our sentences. Now, back to syntactic changes. How do sentences grow? So words can function as noun phrases where a pronoun substitutes for a noun phrase. Instead of Harry and Martha ate the pizza, they ate the pizza. Phrase structures of sentences contain groups of words that fit the slots for allowable syntactic categories. So we can, sorry, I'm trying to find the place in my notes. Elaborating sentences work systematically within the subject noun phrase and or the main verb phrase, such as adding adjectives, articles, prepositional phrases, etc. So there are only certain places where we can add descriptors. We can't add an adjective necessarily to modify a verb because adjectives modify nouns. In prepositional phrases, like after the party, we couldn't say the inebriated driver after the party totaled the car. We could, but it sounds much better to say the inebriated driver totaled the new car after the party. Or we couldn't say the inebriated driver totaled after the party the new car. Because moving after the party after totaled makes after the party being what's the I'm liking what the verb is doing, and that's not what the verb is doing. What was total was the new car, not the party. So there are certain allowable places that we can put things, and to understand that is a very important component of our studies. So sentence meaning is governed by underlying hierarchical structures that allow us to interpret the clusters or words or phrases that convey sense. Categories of words can only be used in certain places in a sentence or structure, like I just demonstrated. And then the book has great examples about parsing these out between the subject, the sentence, the noun phrase, the verb phrase, subject, predicate. We have articles, adjectives, nouns, verbs, prepositions, noun phrases, prepositional phrases. There's a lot going on in the sentence as that grew from just the driver totaled the car, just by adding some adjectives and other descriptive terms. So we can grow sentences by adding those specific elements of adjective, articles, prepositional phrases. We can grow sentences by making them more complex, by doing compound sentences, adding relative clauses, adding other types of clauses to make them more longer, more complex sentences. And these are the types of things that you can do with your students. Now, transformations. So sentences are classified as statements, questions, imperatives, or exclamations. And those are generally the types of sentences we have. Linguists must understand the syntactic rules or how sentences are transformed. And a transformation is an operation that moves phrases around within a given sentence or structure. So how do we transform a question into a statement? Or how do we transform a statement into a question? Our syntactic knowledge tells us that we can move some phrases and not others. We can move phrases to certain positions but not others. And certain rules must be followed to change a simple sentence from a positive statement to a negative statement, a passive voice statement, or an interrogative. So we have rules we have to follow, and we know these rules if we're fluent speakers of our language. As speech language pathologists, you all are. So teaching sentence structure. How do we teach this complex skill? Our goal is to build students' awareness of incomplete sentences, run-on sentences, awkward expressions, ambiguity, clearly or poorly expressed meaning, and conventions of grammar. So we can develop sentence awareness with sentence manipulation exercises. The scrambled sentences task, which would be a sentence that the words are all mixed up and you have to rearrange them to make sense. Complete the subject or predicate. Finish the sentence, the frisky dog blank bought a toy. So you add a subject or a predicate to it. You can generate questions from statements. So the war ended with a truce and a compromise. How did the war end? And there's a lot that can be done with this in therapy with our language disorder children, because this is what they need to be taught. They need to be taught how a question following a paragraph, it can be directly related to the statement in the paragraph, particularly early on. Now, when you get into more inferential type questions where it's not explicitly stated, then you have to teach them how to read between the lines and draw conclusions. But initially, if the sentence says the big brown dog ate all of the cat's food, you'd say, who ate all of the cat's food? And you show them that the who is a substitution for the big brown dog. There's sentence combining, where the quarterback threw the ball. The quarterback was helped by great blocking. So let's take that. The quarterback who was helped by great blocking threw the ball. Or with the help of great blocking, the quarterback threw the ball. There's lots of ways we can combine those sentences to make them more complex. You can begin a sentence with a subordinate clause. After the storm passed, ... This is very difficult for our language disorder kids. This is a skill you'll see on some of our language tests, where they're given the word after and they have to form a sentence. I have to form a sentence with before. And the complexity of this being dependent clauses and relative clauses, it is challenging for our students. You can expand a simple sentence by adding information about who, what, when, where, why, or how. So that's where you add adjectives and articles, and not articles, but adverbs and prepositional phrases. You can join two independent clauses, not toe, with a coordinating conjunction. Just like pancakes, so just like pancakes, but. And then you can identify the subject and predicate. And sometimes this can be difficult because, in the example it gives in the book, our founding fathers, stung by the experiences of British domination and mindful of the state's desire for autonomy, provided, after much debate, a good balance of federal and states' rights in the Constitution. Our subject is there in the first, our founding fathers. Our predicate is provided. And all of those other things are just modifiers and clauses and things that make this add to the sentence's complexity and expression. Like I said, that makes the sentence very flowery, makes it sound pretty. But that's oftentimes how our content-specific subjects, such as science and social studies, are written. So let's move on to semantics. What are semantics? Actually, what is semantics initially? Because I think of semantics as one concept, but it does look plural, so I changed it to R to match. But that is the linguist, and that can be in me, and that can be a up for debate kind of linguistic idea. So semantics, the nature of meaning, is the least understood and most abstract area of linguistics. This is the most complex, essentially, even more complex than syntax. Lexical semantics is the study of word meanings. Sentential semantics is the study of sentence meanings. And then pragmatics is the study of social context and its effect on meaning interpretation. So often when you're talking about the 5 essential elements of language, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. With pragmatics, it can be a function of semantics because it has to do with understanding. And the social context and its interpretation. And pragmatics is also where discourse falls, which we'll talk about that in a little while, but I know we talked about it in the first or second week's studies of this course. So when we look at meaning construction and how we interpret things, it's individual and it's personal. We're bringing our background knowledge to our knowledge of the words and making our own associations. Everybody's association of what a dog is probably different because you're thinking about your little pet dog at home, and I'm thinking about my big 40-pound, not even 6-month-old puppy that I have out back. So everybody's going to individualize the meaning of words and what they would use to define it. So we have to have comprehension monitoring, which is our sense of our own understanding or misunderstanding, and the ability to say, hey, I don't understand that. Let me reread, or let me ask for clarification if it's an oral communication. Verbal knowledge is organized in networks of associations that have definable structures. Effective teaching of vocabulary involves listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So when we know what we know about vocabulary and our understanding is that it's all organized into a network, much like the example from last week about the red hammer, that we file things and categorize things in our brains, essentially in our networks, to know how to be able to more quickly access them. So when we're teaching these, we need to be able to refine those networks and make their access more, make the access quicker and more accessible. All right, so aspects of word meaning. Word meanings are agreed on by speakers of a language. So we all know that we've invented words. Every year we have new words added to the dictionary. So we agreed on the definitions of the words, like the selfie example, based on the collective group of the speakers of the language. Our lexicon is our mental dictionary residing in the brain that contains more information about words than a dictionary would be able to print. Again, I use the example of the dog. Your dictionary definition of a dog or a canine would be very different than your mental representation of a dog. You have denotative and connotative meanings. And of course, you remember this from English. Denotative is the formal definition. It describes a theory, quality, action, or relationship denoted by the word. So in the Webster's, you might look up dog and you'll see different definitions of what a dog is beyond just a canine, like the slang term of describing a bad person. He's just a dog. Or maybe even the expressions, I don't have a dog in that fight. Then we have the connotative meanings. Those are the triggers of the networks of associations to other words, ideas. So dog and canine, and we associate that with animals. So we might associate it with a farm animal because we have dogs on a farm, and we might associate it with pets, and we might have dear feelings towards a dog, or maybe you're one of those people who unfortunately has been bitten by a dog, so you have negative connotations with dogs and in what they could could happen when you encounter one. So the denotative and the connotative meanings are very different for connotative are very different for each individual. So we have definitions and semantic features. Denotative meaning, again, comes from definitions that may include an alternate phrase or synonym, the category of the word, and the characteristics or features of meaning that distinguish the word. Content words are defined by the category they belong to and the properties of the option, action, or idea, including grammatical class. And we want to look at this, and we want to start considering semantic features, which are the essential and peripheral attributes that define words. So if you look at figure 7.1 on page 178, it's an example of the different types of semantic features of the word commotion. So synonyms, other categories, connotation, definition, antonyms, examples, and whatnot. So there's all of these other attributes coming into play just beyond just the straight up dictionary definition, which is what you're used to teaching in school. So you have superordinate categories, which is the umbrella under which specific words or concepts fit. Such dog, example, is an animal. And then the subordinate category, rather, are the peripheral attributes of the word that what we associate with it. So superordinate is the category. Subordinate are things that fall under dog, so or under the word. So there are hierarchical ideas that evolve our understanding as we develop our lexicon through these categories. So we're using the superordinate categories to quickly find the word, like the example last week of the red as the color and the hammer as the tool. Those are the superordinate categories, versus the subordinate categories are the particular descriptions we think of or associations we make with the words red or hammer. Like red, we might associate heart. That's a subordinate category. Identifying superordinate and subordinate categories is critical to reading and to writing. So how do all these words work together and come into play, the synonyms and the antonyms, and how we use all these other terms to describe words that we know or don't know. So semantic properties are attributes of content words. With the more of what we have, leads to a deeper vocabulary learning. In other words, the more we know about the word, the better understanding we will have of it and be able to express it. And it's very easy to define concrete words like dog and red and other things that we have quick access to because we're so familiar with them. But it's more difficult to define words that we might not have quick access to, that might be less familiar to us, such as incredulous. That's just a word that popped into my head. We might take a little while to be able to appropriately define incredulous. So what are some definitions of, what's the difference between definitions and semantic features? Continued. Another semantic feature we can consider are synonyms. They exist on a continuum, and with the idea that perfect synonyms do not exist. So some words are closer synonymously than others. The book uses an example of car and automobile. They're near perfect synonyms, but of course automobile is going to bring different connotations than car and be used in different contexts. You're not going to say, I saw the red automobile driving down the road the other day. You're going to say, I saw that red car driving down the road. Versus the van and truck example, where van and truck are often used to describe the same type of vehicle, but they're further apart in their meaning. Van and trucks are both large, but what you picture a van to be and what I picture a van to be, or a truck, could be very different because it just depends on the definition. You think of that about like the delivery vans or the delivery trucks and the potato chip trucks or something like that. Not the semi 18-wheeler automatics and not the vans like the minivans mom's driving, but those smaller delivery. Is it a van or is it a truck? They're synonymous because you might hear people describe them in similar ways. So perfect synonyms do not exist. Now we have class membership, in which words share semantic properties, and this is called the priming effect. And we have the priming effect. It allows us to recognize words faster within context by prior activation of the semantic network and memory. If you know what's coming, if you know what subject and content area you're in, you'll be able to more quickly access it. So the example the book uses is math. You'll recognize mathematical terms and read them a little bit faster than we would if there were no context. So if you're in math and you're reading about math and it throws a linguistic term at you like semantics, that's going to throw you off, and you're going to have to probably reread because of the context to understand what the context of semantics is and fitting into a math reading problem. So the priming effect, again, that was that video example we had last week too, of the red hammer. Formal marking of semantic features. We can do a semantic feature analysis, which is the process of identifying the meaning elements that words share or do not share. Words have other properties that determine how they can be used in sentences and what words they can combine with. We have countable nouns that can take quantifier adjectives, such as many and few, and we have non-countable or mass nouns that can take the adjectives much and less. So we can't really, when we think of a few, we probably think of 3 or less, but when we think of less, that can be a mass amount of numbers. We really don't have a specific idea of how many much and less represent. They're non-countable. We have antonyms, or words of, well, before I go to antonyms, let's go back to semantic features. I love the exercise on page 181, exercise 7.4, because you can mark the features that you have of a word. And of course, this is going to take some preparation as a teacher or as an SLP to think of 2 words that are synonymous, but what are the differences between the words, and having your students do this to be able to represent, both orally and written language, the differences between those synonymous words. Now, of course, antonyms are words of opposite meaning. You have gradable antonyms, which take meaning from the context in which they are used, and the interpretation depends on the frame of reference. So you have marked versus unmarked features, and we have marked is unmarked feature is the one that we use to ask questions about the attribute. How tall is the athlete? We wouldn't say how short is the athlete if we say he is a short man. He's a short man. We wouldn't say how short. Well, we might say how short he is. Tall and big are unmarked patterns in the anonym pairs. If an object is described as small, then we're likely to ask how big it is instead of how small it is, because of the way our questions are asked. Now, we also have complementary antonyms, which are dichotomous. Sorry, had to use my phonology and my lexicon to remember how to spell that. I mean, not spell it, pronounce it. But they're dichotomous, and they do not represent points on a scale. We also have, so they're complementary if one condition exists and the other cannot, and vice versa. Black and white, they really don't have the gray areas. Male, female, single, married or single, dead or alive, pregnant or not pregnant. You might hear somebody say, she's just a little pregnant. You can't be a little pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. So complementary antonyms that don't represent gradability, in which something can be a little bit of this or a little bit more of that. We also have relational antonyms, which imply reciprocal relationships, and they don't represent mutually exclusive qualities. They represent a reciprocal relationship, like it's parent-child, supervisor-supervisee, doctor-patient. So they're not exact opposites of each other, but they are reciprocal. If you say someone's a parent, you make the assumption that they have a child. That's the type of reciprocal relationship. So those are the types of gradable and complementary antonyms. Now, finally, you have words of multiple meaning, which are many, many Anglo-Saxon words. And so you have to know the meaning based on the context of which they're written. You can't just see R-E-A-D and know it's read versus read without the context. And so they're known as polysemous words. They have multiple meanings. And look at all the meanings that it gives you of the word run. Isn't that the word? It listed 8 definitions of the word run. And some of those definitions didn't come to mind as my initial definition of the word run. Move the legs in a fast gait is what I would describe. But when it describes a path for skiers, that's not what I would have initially thought of for run. I'm not even sure I could have come up with that on my own, that was a definition of run, because it's less familiar to me because, of course, we don't have snow skiing in South Mississippi. So phrase and sentence meaning. Phrase meaning depends on word meanings and structural combination of words. So you can paraphrase things whenever you reduce what a sentence is saying and make it into your own and put it in your own words. It preserves the meaning, but it changes the words. So we had a lot of fun at work doing the exercise 7.8, such as a curious fantasy. I said, I think, an odd adventure or an odd tale. So we have different responses from everybody about those, how to paraphrase those particular phrases. And that's a skill that you'll be able to teach students, and students need to know how to do when it comes to retelling or conveying the message of a passage they just read. We have noun phrases, where phrase meaning is organized around nouns and verbs, and that's the kernel sentence, which is the minimal sentence with a head noun and a main verb. The meaning depends on how adjectives, articles, and clauses are combined. So putting something in different places can change the meaning of the sentence. For example, the book uses tile floors are different from floor tiles. And when it includes the prepositional phrase, it conveys the relationship between the head noun and the noun that follows the preposition. Now, when it comes to reference, that's the relationship between a noun phrase and the object idea to which it points, or a referent. So co-reference are two or more terms that refer to the same thing. So in the use of example, white fang, proper noun, wolf, he, and snarling brute all might refer to the same animal and therefore co-referential. The reference what it's referring to, and so that's like our pronouns, I and they and their. And the exercise 7.9 is quite an adventure to identify all the reference. And you can see how the interpretation can be lost for struggling readers, because the referent was so far removed from the noun it was referencing that they lose the meaning of the sentence. So verb phrases. Verbs play the central role in the meaning and structure of sentences, and they have thematic roles. These are the transitive properties of a verb, or verbs that stand alone, must take a direct object, and must take direct and indirect objects. Those are the types of transitive properties. Verbs of sentences have semantic properties that affect the selection and role of the noun phrases and prepositional phrases, the action, the theme, the location, the goal, etc. And so it lists all of those different thematic roles that verbs can play. The agent is the doer, the one who performs the action, versus the source is the place from which an action originates. They tract from the base. So you must know how the verb must be used in relation to semantic properties of noun phrases. Then you also have the truth value, which are the facts, events, or states of being in sentences that may be true or false. Sentences that mean the same have the same truth condition. So if the sentences mean the same thing, the same truths are there. And the book gave the example about the Mark McGwire, about the truth. He hit 30 home runs in the 1998 baseball season. I initially read that and said, well, what's wrong with that? But it says he hit 70. Well, I don't know anything about baseball, so to me it is a truth, because I didn't have enough context knowledge to know that it was a false statement, because the sentence makes sense and follows all the rules that we know, besides the fact being that it just was a false number. So one sentence entails another if the truth of one sentence includes the truth of another. There's an assumption there. If Paula has lived with her husband for 20 years, gives you entails the sentence that Paula is married. The cat was buried yesterday implies the cat died. So those are the truths of sentences. Then we have verb phrases containing, we have nonsense. That sometimes sentences make no sense for various reasons. And it uses the example of all the various nursery rhymes that we have, and have lots of the language games that you can play where you just make up a word to fit in to rhyme. Well, imagine how confusing that can be for children who are learning language and struggling with language. And then we have special phrases or idioms. Our children with autism spectrum disorders and social deficits really struggle with idioms and metaphors. All languages use word combinations that don't mean literally the sum of what their individual words mean. We all have idioms in every single language. And idioms are phrases used to convey meanings and resist evolutionary modification of form. When interpreted literally, however, they can mean something quite different. And my goose is cooked. Get off your high horse. He took me to the clean air zone. Of course, it's raining cats and dogs is a common one. All of these things that we have in general phrases that could really baffle our students who struggle with learning language and how to interpret that meaning. And then metaphors are the most common figures of speech. It's an implied or indirectly stated comparison between an idea and an unusual referent. So the Moors are meeker than they were. I'm sorry, that's a poem, but things that use like or as, similes and metaphors. The berry's cheek is plumper. The nuts are getting brown. The rose is out of town. The maple wears a grayer scarf. The field of scarlet gown. Lest I should be old-fashioned, I'll put a trinket on. That's the poem on Emily Dickin's about on page 190, and it's about autumn, and it's about how the leaves are changing. But you have to understand that when it says the maple wears a grayer scarf, we're not literally putting a gray scarf on a maple tree. It's a metaphor for saying that the leaves are changing color. So, of course, poetry has many, many metaphors, but also other literary reference. So we need to be mindful of that when we're choosing text or whenever we're looking at the curriculum and the expectations of the students. Is there metaphorical meaning there that they need to be interpreting they might struggle with because they struggle with language? So pragmatics and discourse. And this is very important for you to understand when you're considering language science. So many of our students can do well in isolation. You give them any language test and they'll do fine, or they'll score in the low average to average range. But when they just talk, it doesn't make any sense. They don't know how to answer questions. They don't know how to respond to the context. So pragmatics is making sense in context. Context is the conditions that surround the use of language, and they may be situational or linguistic. Now, situational contexts are all the real-life circumstances in which verbal communication takes place and the relationships among those who are communicating. What we know about the sensitivities and needs of our listener, and that's also called considerate text. Now, a linguistic context is the words that precede and follow a given phrase or sentence, and the discourse in which the language is embedded. So the linguistic context is more complex. The situational context is, nonverbal language and responding to facial expressions and responding how the listener is responding to you. But the linguistic context is there in the reading and the written component. So we have discourse, which are the combinations of sentences that are woven together to convey complex ideas. So most of our written text is at the discourse level. It's stories or it's science text talking about the process of photosynthesis or other things that make the world work. In addition, we have dialect to consider, which is the home language patterns versus the academic language. And the knowledge that you have to bring to know when to code switch to be able to write in academic language versus communicate in the home language pattern. And then we have for expressive language with pragmatics, we choose words and construct sentences according to the social demands of the situation and the context of the communication. Where you're going to speak differently to me as your professor than you're going to speak to me as the parent of one of your students, or as a friend in a social setting at maybe a concert, or to me as mission president. We all have different ways we express ourselves depending on the social setting. And so if we, people who have difficulty with this seem to disregard the social constraints, just, are seen as having no filter, essentially. And we need to work with that on with our students a lot of times as well. We also have reference and discourse. So what type of reference? I think I'm saying this right. Anaphora is the replacement of a whole noun phrase through unit or sentence with a pronoun. Teaching spelling with the new program is so effective that I make time for it every day. It being the new program. It refers to more spelling. The pronoun refers to teaching spelling with the new program, an elaborated noun phrase. So being able to understand what those anaphoric referents are. In the in written discourse, it's not uncommon to find the anaphoric referent for a pronoun some distance away from the pronoun in the text. And I believe I mentioned that earlier. Then you have the deixis, which is the relationship of a word to its referent that relies exclusively on situational context. The pronouns of first and second person, such as I, you, we, yours, ours, and my, always depend on the specific context of the speaker. If the referent is or misunderstood, then comprehension suffers. So now that we know all this about semantics, how do we teach it? We know that variance in reading comprehension is highly attributable to knowing the meanings of individual words. So vocabulary is one of the best ways we can improve reading comprehension. We can do this in various ways, and these are just examples. You can choose words for direct teaching that are central in a semantic field, but you want to choose them from the classroom curriculum because words are learned within a network of related ideas pertinent to a topic, theme, or text. You can teach word meanings in relation to other words that are known and learn words as part of a network of ideas, and it uses the example of the graphic techniques and semantic maps. But, if you're teaching the word canine, for instance, to a child, you're going to reference a dog and say a canine is a big word for a dog. So use things they already know to teach them the new words. You want to use linguistics and situational context to develop word knowledge. And we know that most new words are learned from reading. You want to teach denotative and connotative meanings. So what kind of feelings do the words invoke? Or what kind of associations do you make with that new word? You want to teach multiple meanings for the same word, which deepens and broadens the student's vocabulary knowledge and may facilitate word recognition, retrieval, and comprehension. There's not just one right definition. There's often many interpretations of the different words we use. You want to teach idioms, metaphors, and other figures of speech. And then you want to identify the reference for nouns, pronouns, and phrases, what everything is referring to for those noun phrases and verb phrases and those subjects and predicates. That is syntax and semantics.